2 months after Prigozhin's failed mutiny, Putin has had his revenge. Prigozhin's plane, carrying the top 3 figures in the Wagner group, was shot out of the sky. Let's reflect on how extraordinary this is. Russia is shooting Russian planes out of the sky 185 miles from Moscow. We can assume political verticality to the crash, that's to say that Mr. Putin is behind it. But why was Prigozhin's end so demonstrative, so spectacularly theatric? Why did it involve the murder of not only Utkin and Chikalov, but the 3 crew members of the plane? Why not just shoot him, as with Nemtsov, or do Novichok, as with the Skripals, Litvinenko and Navalny? We can see the spectacular show as a political act, a show of force to discourage future rebellions. We got here via a madness that had method to it, that degenerated into a madness without method. Prigozhin, the criminal turned hot dog vendor turned presidential chef turned mercenary leader, was one of the most powerful insider-outsider figures in Putin's court. That in itself didn't present a threat to Mr. Putin, who ruled by outsourcing presidential powers to his court and then refereeing the conflicts between them. At first, Prigozhin's conflict with Shoigu worked in just that way. It helped Putin by deflecting blame for the failing war onto Shoigu. But then it got out of hand and it became clear that Prigozhin was attacking not Shoigu, but Putin himself, and this culminated in the Wagner convoy heading toward Moscow and shooting down 6 helicopters and 1 plane. Putin was caught wimpish and furious. It took him half a day to react to the mutiny. In a speech in which he implored people to protect him and his regime, and irradiated incandescent rage at Prigozhin, because Prigozhin triggered Putin's worst fear, ending up like Gaddafi, and Putin's biggest moral taboo, which is political betrayal.
Уметь прощать? Да. Но не все. А что невозможно простить? Предательство.
Prigozhin's mutiny introduced an irreversible crack in Putin's perceived legitimacy. Now, for the depoliticized majority of the Russian population, it was ever slightly more possible to imagine a future without Putin. Prigozhin's cards were marked since the mutiny.
Is now pulling back after a deal was brokered between both sides.
The group announced his forces would end a march on
What's he going to do now that he's in Belarus? Sit on his hands?
Renewing his criticism of Russia's conduct of...
Back in business in Belarus, the man who defied President Putin and lived to tell the tale, for now.
But why did 2 months pass between the mutiny and the plane crash? What took Putin so long? What's more, during these 2 months, Putin tolerated Prigozhin traveling to Russia.
Has been seen in Russia since the insurrection.
Says Prigozhin is in Russia.
And even participating in public events such as the African Leaders Summit in St. Petersburg. Why wasn't Prigozhin killed sooner? It's possible he had compromise on Putin and his circle, and they waited to extract it out of him before ending his life. Alexander Baunov, who wrote a book about how dictatorships end, said one of the technologies of punishment within a dictatorship is to bring the enemy traitor closer before destroying them. It's possible that Putin was too weak to eliminate Prigozhin straight away when his myth was at its zenith. His house raid made global news, revealing wigs, guns, fake passports, gold and cash, and even a giant stuffed alligator. The Kremlin was trying to deflate the myth of Prigozhin and kill him off as a political actor. It's possible that Putin was looking for a non-fatal resolution, which he couldn't find. It's possible that the Russian army holding out against Ukraine's counteroffensive in July and August convinced Putin that Gerasimov and Shoigu can do the job and should be rewarded with the extermination of Prigozhin. It's possible that Prigozhin's elimination wasn't straight away a foregone conclusion, but he kept a very high profile. Had Prigozhin agreed to give up everything when he met Putin, he may have stayed alive. Had he stayed quiet, he may have been poisoned. But Wagnerian ambitions contributed to a Wagnerian outcome. What are the consequences of Prigozhin's death? First, this is not a clash of personalities. It's a deadly manifestation of a deeper problem. It reveals a conflict in the Kremlin and in the Russian elites about how to prosecute the war. There's a party that wants to freeze the war and hold out till Trump's election, and there is a party that wants to escalate the war by militarizing Russian society. So total war versus a breather. Second, many analysts have argued that killing Prigozhin stabilizes the Putin regime, but this misses the point. The Russian regime is in a slow-moving spiral. Whatever it does, it becomes less stable and erodes its monopoly over organized violence. Killing and not killing Prigozhin would have both slightly undermined the regime's stability and perception of perceived legitimacy. The depoliticized majority of the Russian population would have been reminded by this drama that something is very wrong. But for now, that is all the more reason to look away from politics because of the depoliticized state that they're in, and hope that the inevitable calamity of Putin's war passes them by. Already conspiracies are emerging on social media that Prigozhin wasn't on that plane and that he wouldn't fly together with his top brass. Some people will continue to believe that Prigozhin is alive and that he will return to Russia. The myth of Prigozhin will take on a life of its own, and it will be exploited by different political actors in Russia, often to the detriment of Mr. Putin. Third, Prigozhin's death is a stage along the process of the war moving onto Russian soil. There is even an outside possibility that one day the war will only take place on Russian soil, that it will involve no Ukrainians, but only Russians and Russians. Fourth, Prigozhin's death is a relief for the army, at least until the next crisis. Fifth, the Putin regime will increasingly fail to resolve its problems and conflicts via non-fatal means. We're going to see Russia slide into increasingly totalitarian turns and more and increasingly more poorly controlled purges and repressions. There is a poetry to Prigozhin's death. He became a victim of the lawless and violent world in which he himself thrived as a protagonist. Another somewhat poetic death was the killing of Alexander Dugin's daughter a year ago, which Washington attributed directly or indirectly to Ukraine. Dugin, the reactionary philosopher and darling of the West, has done an extraordinary feat of verbal gymnastics over the past year. First, he declared that Prigozhin was Russia's spiritual leader, and then he backpedaled rapidly once the mutiny happened. Dugin is playing a high-risk game, and he may well be in danger now. To understand the reactionary entrepreneurialism of the Dugin family, watch this video next.